Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The RSE is Scotland's national academy. As a charity, it seeks to provide public benefit through the contribution of its large range of distinguished fellows. My name is Alison Elliott, and I'm the General Secretary of the RSE. This event is part of a series around artificial intelligence, with the title RSE Investigates AI. Our talk today is given by Professor Shannon Vallor, who holds the Baillie Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence in the University of Edinburgh. She's a philosopher with a wide range of working in industry as well as in the university. Her topic today is Technology's Moral Debt in the COVID-19 Era, How Borrowing Against Public Trust Cost Us Public Health. Shannon will talk for 10 minutes and then we'll have 20 minutes for a Q&A session. You can submit a question at any time via the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and the event will be recorded and live streamed to YouTube. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I know that we are doing this on a relatively short time scale, so let's jump right in. I want to first just briefly orient you to my background and approach. I'm a philosopher. My work is focused on the ethics of emerging technologies, particularly the ethics of data-driven innovation, AI, robotics, data science, new media. And I'm really interested in the way that technological development interfaces with moral and social progress and moral and social functioning or flourishing. So what I'm going to talk about today is a moment of crisis for the human family, certainly for communities across the UK and Scotland, but really something that has arrived, I'm going to argue, at the worst possible time for us, at a time when many nominally advanced, technologically, scientifically, democratically advanced societies were actually least prepared to meet this crisis. And the premise of my talk is this, that in the decades leading up to the present COVID-19 crisis, many such societies have been accumulating for decades a heavy burden of moral debt. Okay, what do I mean by moral debt? I'll talk more about that over the next 10 minutes, but let me start off by saying that moral debt accrues when a society borrows against public trust in putting off or delaying essential moral work that is needed to address deep structural problems in society. And the result of taking on too much moral debt is declines in social cohesion, in economic and social security, and in social resilience to crisis. So I'm arguing that our societies, many of them, have been taking on various forms of this moral debt at levels that were unsustainable and that have shown themselves to be unsustainable by the present crisis. I'm also going to try to talk about what we can do to get out of that bind. But let me go a little bit deeper into the problem. I also want to show that this moral debt that societies are taking on is partly enabled by technology and technological development. Technology plays an important role in this moral debt in two ways. First, societies often rely upon quick technical fixes, or really not fixes, but temporary patches to cover over the deep structural problems for which the society has been delaying the moral work needed to do kind of deep lasting repairs. So the kinds of structural problems I'm talking about are rising social precarity and economic precarity, as well as rising inequality, decaying physical infrastructure, from transportation networks to supply chains to bridges and roads, to fraying civic ties and declines in social cohesion and solidarity. We can think of the dramatic increases in political division that we've seen in many of the societies in the English-speaking world in particular, a weakened social safety net, deep, long-standing problems of social injustice and unfairness that have not been addressed, whether those be unfairnesses linked to racial discrimination, gender discrimination, age discrimination, discrimination against people with disabilities. We could go on with that list, but the idea is that sort of basic problems of social fairness have been largely deferred or stalled in their remedies for quite some time in many such societies. Declines in democratic participation, and unsustainable resource consumption. So those are the kinds of deep structural problems that I'm suggesting that many societies have delayed focusing on or really repairing in an enduring way. And instead, we've used technologies to kind of put temporary patches over some of these things. I'll give you just two examples. If you think about the problems that we have online with disinformation, with a lack of political and civic cohesion that lead to online harassment, abuse, manipulation. There are some deep structural reasons why those things are happening, but we have not solved them at a social level. We've developed tools like AI content moderation, which work relatively poorly, actually, but we've used those as a stopgap measure to try to put a cap on the kinds of toxic exchanges that are happening in online environments. If you think about the gaps we have in our social care system, and in many English-speaking countries and other countries in Western Europe, you have an aging population that isn't well cared for, that we don't have a social system that's really doing well at social care. But our solution to that is not to fix those deeper structural problems, but to develop things like AI-enabled care bots or in-home surveillance systems that will provide the kind of temporary patch for those deeper social problems. Technology is also itself often a source of moral debt. If we think about the fact that we have for many years been designing, developing, and deploying new technologies in ways that have ignored their ethical and social risks or pushed their costs onto more vulnerable members of society. So we can think about the problems with weak data protections, privacy and surveillance risks, government abuse of such technologies, algorithmic bias and unfairness, a lack of transparency in automated decisions, the economic and social impacts of automation on the workforce, which have not been addressed, and the aforementioned problems of disinformation online, conspiracy theories, information manipulation, deep fakes, the inability to maintain a healthy information ecosystem instead of a polluted one. And we have focused on technology as something that should reach the market as quickly as possible without necessarily addressing first these sort of deeper ethical and social risks that are attached to it. And what I'm arguing is that what we see when we take on this kind of debt is it builds up interest. There's a related concept in software design called technical debt, where if you move a product into the market too fast and you take too many shortcuts in order to deliver it to your customer, the product itself, its quality is degraded and its resilience is degraded such that over time you're going to have to spend more, or your customer's going to have to spend more to repair and replace that software than would have been spent upfront to just make a good, resilient, well-functioning, safe piece of software in the first place. So I'm arguing that just as software developers sometimes take on too much technical debt, we as a society have taken on too much moral debt. And the problem is that it has come due at exactly the wrong time. It has come due at a time where we actually needed to draw upon the principle, meaning public trust in scientific, technical, and government expertise that's needed to collectively manage a global public health crisis. So we have allowed, as I've mentioned, problems of social cohesion, of disinformation, of lack of trust in technology to be used safely and responsibly, particularly by powerful agents like corporations and governments. We've allowed those problems to kind of bubble up and sort of ferment without addressing them. And now we're at a moment where we have a public health crisis where we need all of the scientific, technical, and governmental expertise on hand available, as well as profound levels of public buy-in and cooperation and even sacrifice in order to meet the challenges in front of us. And we're finding that we are not seeing in many countries the levels of social trust and compliance that we need in order to respond effectively to COVID. We are seeing a distrust and low adoption levels, for example, in the apps that are being developed for contact tracing, which themselves are showing signs of this moral debt I've been talking about. That is, many of the apps that have been developed have neither been technically or morally adequate to the task because they've been rushed, because they've been developed without sufficient care to the privacy concerns, to the usability concerns, and so forth. So I'm arguing that we need to step back for a moment, and we need to think about what are sort of the deep social challenges that we need to address head on before trying to paper over them with technical fixes that will show themselves quite quickly in a crisis to be inadequate, and actually have a long-term effect of further decreasing public faith in science and technology, such that when you need it, for example, when you need people to trust in the power of vaccines to help get us out of this crisis, you will see people pull away from scientific experts who are talking about the promise of these kinds of scientific and technical developments because those deeper social issues of trust have not been addressed. So I think there are ways we can move forward from here, but I think we can't move forward until we recognize how we got here, until we recognize the mistakes that were made by taking on far too much moral debt, both in our technical systems and in our social systems, far too much moral debt. And I think we need to be honest about that and move forward with humility and new kinds of strategies for addressing these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. That was a whirlwind tour, really, of a very big subject and very interesting. Thank you very much. We've got some questions coming in. Can I start, though, with one question? Your talk emphasizes the importance of public trust, but surely it's also important to challenge those in authority and to adopt a skeptical attitude to the information that we're being given. How do you answer that?
Sorry, I was on mute there. It's a great question, and it's really about being able to calibrate that balance between trust and critical attention. And these are not actually opposites. These have to go together, which I think is part of the point, right? That you don't have trust in an environment where you can't ask hard questions. And one of the things we're seeing, for example, around the response to COVID is, I think, a failure of many governments to demonstrate the kinds of humility and openness to critique that actually build public trust. So, for example, there's governments who have really been quite honest about the challenges of building a contact tracing app and the fact that it's not a Band-Aid, the fact that it doesn't actually replace the traditional modes of contact tracing and public health work that still need to be invested in. But you've seen some other governments, I think, exaggerate the power of technology to come in and save us, and to speak as if these technologies are going to be coming out of the gate as sort of world-class tools that we can embrace uncritically. When in fact, what would be a more successful strategy is to say, here are the problems with these technologies. Here are the things that make this hard to do right. Work with us in a transparent way to tell us what your concerns are and what you would need to see in order to adopt a tool like this and feel comfortable using it. And we will be able to have an open public conversation about that challenge and meet it together. But most governments have been in a mode of trust us, we've got the best people. And the best people who we won't show you the contracts that we have with them, but trust us, we've got the best people and we've got the best technology, and here it is. Oh, wait, no, it's not very good. We'll come back to you with something else later, right? And that unfortunately has been what's happened with the UK COVID app that just a few weeks ago was announced would not be moving forward on the original model. And that's okay. I actually think, you know, it's healthy to admit that, nope, this doesn't work. But it's better if you've set expectations up front in a more transparent way than to promise something, to overpromise and underdeliver. So I think we have to calibrate this balance between what we reasonably should expect of expertise and leadership, and what we expect from the public in terms of being partners in developing a critical conversation around technology and society and its challenges.
That's great. And that it'd be interesting to see whether that explains a lot of the differences that there are across countries and the way in this, how successful they've been in dealing with the pandemic. Thank you. Yeah. We've got a question here about data trusts. And are they just another land grab of personal data between vested interests? Or what's the basis of trust and trustworthiness, and how can it be demonstrated?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of, there's a lot of open questions about data trusts and in what context they might be the right model for us. I think there are contexts in which data trust might be the right model to work from. I think we have to think about also, when we think about data, I really want to push against the model that thinks about data as a mere resource. The whole data is the new oil metaphor is very, very dangerous because it treats data as a material resource to be owned and traded and commodified, as opposed to what it really is, which is a reflection of human lives. And so we can talk about putting something in a trust. And that's a helpful way of treating something as a common good rather than a private good, something perhaps to be managed as a public, as opposed to hoarded and exchanged purely for economic value. So I do think that the data trust model can help us think about data as a shared resource and something that is managed for the public interest. But I also think in some contexts, we need to move beyond thinking of data as even as a resource in the common ownership, and think about data in different ways as reflections of people that have to be treated in a way, the way that we treat people's bodies, for example, as part of the subject, as part of the person who is deserving of care and concern. So in some contexts, I think we need to maybe even go further than data trusts and think about how do we handle data as something that's an extension of the persons whose lives it reflects.
Good. Well, we've got various questions coming in about what we do about all of this and where we go from here. There's one question about how would it be possible to develop a cohesive system of situation ethics to address the moral debt, and what would be the role of civil society in developing something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I think we are going to be, part of the premise of my argument is that there are no quick fixes for the circumstance in which we find ourselves. There are ways we can move forward more successfully than others. But part of what I'm arguing for is a long-term investment that needs to happen now to address some of these deeper structural issues so that we are more ready to meet the next crisis that arrives on our doorstep, because there will be the next crisis. In fact, climate change already is arguably the next crisis that is already here, but also is going to need progressively more from the public in terms of cooperation, in terms of solidarity, in terms of participation in collective governance, and in terms of kind of the practical wisdom that we need to meet these situations that are novel and that require us to modify, if you will, the moral scripts that we've been used to. And you see that in the COVID era, when people are asked to change their behavior in radical ways, you have to be able to have a society that's ready to move together and deliberate about what needs to change quickly. And I think it's going to take time before we really get into a place where the next crisis that requires immediate public coordination can be met as well as we need to. But I do think in the short term, there are some things that we can do now quite quickly. And I think that is for governments to recognize this challenge and to be open and honest about why we're struggling to meet it in the present era. I think you have a lot of governments around the world who want to instill public confidence and who want to say, everything's good, we're doing great. But I think there are moments when you look at the facts, you look at the data, and you have to say, we're actually not doing great. Let's have an honest conversation with ourselves about why we've fallen short in this moment and what we can do together to build a better kind of society that's more resilient than the one that we have today. I think, yes, please.
So there's a role for civil society in that, in developing that kind of.
Absolutely. And I think because, in fact, we are so politically divided in many nations, and technology has been fueling those divisions. I think one of the really important roles of civil society is to begin to have that conversation that is not outside of the political realm. There is no way of getting outside of the political, but that is not tied to these bright line political identities where politics is a zero-sum game. I think civil society has a frame for political conversations in which really it's not a zero-sum game. We all have to get to the right place together. And I think civil society organizations have many more tools, both on the national and international level, for framing those conversations about how do we come together and meet challenges as a community? How do we come together and meet challenges as a human family? And I think that language really needs to come into the forefront of these conversations. And maybe some of the political parties that have been dominating the conversation need to step back and listen.
Still raises the question of the relationship between the scientific community and the social community, or the public, the political one. I mean, what about the kind of possibility of politicians and the political world acknowledging the role of the scientific community? Do you think that has been damaged in the way in which this has been handled?
I do think it has been damaged. And I think if you see in the United States, the most extreme example of this damage, where public health experts and scientists have been treated as pawns in a political game, either captured by political figures and basically told, here's the script, here's what you say, or punished and undermined if they don't follow the script, such that you have many public health experts in the United States, and I do know that to some extent this has happened in the UK, but I don't think it's been quite as severe here. But in the US, you've seen a lot of public health experts who are actually getting death threats online at their homes, who are being attacked not just by politicians, but by people who are receiving signals from politicians that scientists are part of the political enemy that has been framed. And I think you also see a lack of acknowledgement broadly of what good scientific reasoning is. So, for example, you see a lot of debate about the changing advice around masks, or the changing scientific advice around whether 2-meter distancing is adequate, whether indoor spaces are safe, whether it's a good idea to open schools or not. The scientific advice around these topics has evolved, but that's not a sign of science failing. That's a sign of science working as it's supposed to, which is, as new data come in, we are going to learn new things, and we are going to have to revise our best advice on how to act and how to meet this challenge. And we should welcome the evolution of that public health and scientific advice. But instead, you see, for example, in the United States, the White House currently undermining its chief figure of scientific leadership, Anthony Fauci, and their argument is he's changed his mind. He's been inconsistent. in the advice that he's given. And they're using that as a lens to communicate to the public, don't trust this guy. Don't follow what the advice he's giving you because he's changed his mind in the past. That to me is so dangerous, it makes my blood run cold when I see it. Because that's not just about that one scientific expert. That's telling the public going forward that you should not trust people who revise their advice or their policies on the basis of new facts and new data. That's actually terrifying. And the next crisis we meet, if the public has been trained to reject anyone whose advice evolves with the facts, we are going to be in deep, deep, deep trouble. So I think we need to, as scientists then, come together and communicate more openly about what science is, what good scientific practice and reasoning is in the public sphere, and push back against harmful narratives around science that are undermining public trust. And I think you need government to back the scientists in doing that. You need government to say, yes, these scientists are right. We will not always stay with the same advice. We will revise what we know as new information comes in, and we will share that with you. And we need that support of government for the public to actually recognize that science is not magic. It's hard work that deals with uncertainty, and we need everyone to kind of be playing the same game to win, something that we all need, which is, to flourish together as a community.
Well, that fits in with one of the questions. What benefits of social trust can be identified that would encourage people to choose social cohesive strategies for the long term over technological patches in the short term? How would, if you were going to persuade people to take the long-term view, focus our energies?
Well, I would compare what you are seeing now in, for example, in countries where there has been high levels of compliance with social distancing, with lockdowns, with mask wearing. And you see the rewards that people are enjoying in those communities where they've successfully suppressed the virus. And you're seeing in Scotland, for example, signs of the rewards for coming together and trusting the government and public health experts. And what you see is that the economy is actually able to come back in some of those communities in a fuller way. Whereas I'll use the United States, which is my home country, so it's okay if I beat up on it. You can use the United States as the counterexample, right? People were not encouraged to come together and make sacrifices for one another's safety. And instead, they were encouraged to go out and expose themselves in order to get the economy started as quickly as possible. And what has happened is that now the economies have to go back into lockdown and shut down on a state-by-state and local level, which actually hurts people more than had we had a shorter but more cohesive and well managed lockdown that actually could result in some healthy suppression levels of the virus. So I think when you show people what happens if they work together in the short term, that in the long term, everyone actually enjoys the rewards of that. That's what I think can help people think about, okay, this is actually something that I need to use as a reason to change my practices and take on temporary discomforts so that together we can actually have the society that we want.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that is demonstrating that the example of COVID is something which we are obviously focused on just now, but its benefits will last. I mean, the benefits of this kind of discussion, I'm sure, will last in other areas for a long time to come. So thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you so much. And I agree. I hope we learn from this moment, and I think we can.
Good. Thank you. Right.